Hello everyone and welcome to the Eternal Spoiler Breakdown. My name is Pojo and today we're going to be discussing a new mechanic as well as the first batch of spoilers from the Community Spoilers set. So we're going to be talking about a wild amount of cards. There's also a new cycle of power that we're going to be going over in conjunction with this new mechanic. So stay tuned for that. But first things first, let's talk about the new mechanic. The new mechanic is called Surge. It is a keyword ability that specifically says whenever you gain an influence, do something. So, for example, on this card, Flameheart Patroller, a 2-cost 1/3, when you gain a fire influence, for example, after playing a fire sigil, then it will effectively become a +2 this turn, 3/3 for the turn. But if you play, say, a Praxis Banner, you gain 2 influence, fire and a time, and you'll get a 5/3 instead, which is pretty ridiculously powerful considering this card already has 3 health and is functioning in a very similar sort of space as like Yeti Cookmaster, where you're getting just a lot of extra power out of it in a very short period of time. So yeah, like effectively Surge is an empower type effect. It's a power matters type of effect, but it's a little bit different than your standard landfall or empower because it cares specifically about how much influence you're playing and about whether or not you're playing hybrid influence, which is relevant if you are playing banners and seats and crests and anything along those lines, and generally supports you playing cards that either gain a lot of influence in monocolor or gain a lot of influence in hybrid colors. So either playing lots of banners or doing things like running, for example, the Evangel cycle, where you get influence when you draw the card, that kind of thing. So yeah, other ways to get like extra influence are generally going to be important, and that means that high influence cards are going to be in higher demand as a result of this, but it's also just like a very powerful mechanic in terms of sort of making it so that power matters and making it so that you want to draw power in a game and are actually okay with flooding out in certain circumstances due to the fact that you might have a high variety of Surge units that can really profit off of that ability. So yeah, Flameheart Patroller is a really good example of like how this card can be very powerful. It has some similar attack values to Yeti Cookmaster while having a bit more survivability than that card. It's still certainly vulnerable in some ways, but as an aggressive option for Surge, it seems very good. It's effectively a 3/3 on any turn where you can play a power, and frequently a 5/3 on those turns as well, without really having to do much in your deck to improve on the general influence gain that you're putting in. If you're really putting a lot into the influence gain in the deck, the card can get up to a 7/3 or a 9/3 without maybe too much difficulty. Playing cards like the Fixer Strangers or anything along those lines can really sort of push that card over the top if you're trying to basically just build a limited type or draft type aggro card. Overall, this seems like a really strong draft and limited card. It should be pretty good in Expedition. In Throne, it might struggle a little bit against other just base 3/3s, but the ability to go up to 5 is not something to be discounted in those types of formats, so it's got some potential as an aggro card in Throne, but it's not going to be like the workhorse card. It's just going to be a really good filler card in those circumstances. Next up is Emerald Crafter. Surge, increase Emerald Crafter's Entomb by +1/+1, and Entomb play a 1/1 Emerald Incarnation. So 4-cost 3/3, every time that you Surge, Emerald Crafter gets a little bit bigger. Assumably it keeps count on the card the way that most Eternal cards do, but I will probably just say Entomb play a 2/2 Emerald Incarnation, play a 3/3 Emerald Incarnation in green, the standard the way that you see on Eternal cards. So this card as a 4-cost 3/3 is a little bit understated, but with the Entomb you are getting a 4/4 in stats immediately, and that means that you, since you are typically playing this card on turn 4 or 5, may often get like your actual value in stats from it regardless of what you're doing. Like if you play it on turn 5, you're going to play a green influence afterwards, and then you'll have at least 1 good Entomb off of it. That means the card is a pretty survivable option. The main issue with it is that it does not provide you with a unit that's going to give you something like really big or capable of dealing with larger threats, which can be an issue in a limited format. It's still really stat efficient, or at least stat neutral, and it continues to grow bigger the longer it's out, meaning that your opponent really has to deal with it or silence it in order to deal with it in any sort of meaningful fashion. If silence is popular in limited, this won't be as good of a limited card in general because the stat line is just not that efficient if it gets silenced, but if there are not good silence options available, this card should be reasonably strong in both a limited and expedition format. I don't really see it coming coming into Throne just because it doesn't really seem to have enough stats to really justify its presence. I mean, 4-cost 5/5 with Deadly and Lifesteal is definitely a thing in the format, so is a 5/6 with Endurance. That's probably not going to happen in like larger formats, but as a limited card it seems reasonably strong, and I could see it in Expedition, but I think it's unlikely. It's still a pretty good Surge card, and if you are really playing into the Surge, you can get a big block of stats for very little. The next card is not a Surge card, but it is a Surge Enabler. Badge of Honor is a 2-cost 1/3. Already a really decent stat for a weapon if you're putting it on a unit. Like, that means that you're giving the unit a lot of survivability. There are a lot of units with 1 health that really need cards like this to sort of survive, and if you are then attacking and gaining green influence every turn, you can use that green influence to establish some better stuff. For example, if you really want to play Sedites in your deck, this is a way to do that even if you are playing in a hybrid deck or a 3-color deck, and get some pretty reasonable value out of it, since Badge of Honor makes the unit that you're playing it on pretty sticky. It also allows you, with the extra green influence, to play into some extra protect effects that we're going to be talking about later on. I'm referring specifically to Bubble Shield, which we'll cover later in this video, but like, yeah, so this is a reasonable limited weapon, and again, a pretty reasonable Expedition weapon. I don't know how strong it would be in Throne, seeing as like it is just a weapon and it doesn't provide you with a lot of reach, but the survivability on the card is really interesting. It ups certain masteries, it makes it so that you are able to attack with just larger units in general, and like, it makes units a little bit more survivable. Obviously, it still has the standard weapon trade-off of a card for value. If your opponent is using any hard removal of any kind, Defile or Annihilate, that is not a card that you're going to want to see on this unit. So like, the strength of it is not particularly high, but I would say that it is a nice workhorse in terms of enabling influence-related strategies and really enabling Surge, because if you're playing with green Surge cards, you get to attack with Badge of Honor and get double your Surge for your value. So this card clearly pairs very well with any type of Surge card. You can even put it on red Surge cards and still get the Surge that you want from the green influence, because of course that Surge ability is not specific to what color the card that has Surge is. Alright, our final Surge card is sort of the big splashy one, but it is a rare. Severin of the Dark. Glad to see our friend Severin one more time, and also in excellent form. Severin of the Dark is a 5/7 Surge for 6. Play a 3/1 Piercing Grief with Charge, Lifesteal, and Revenge that dies at the end of your turn whenever you Surge. So, meaningfully, Severin of the Dark plus a Feln banner means that you are playing a turn 7 card that plays a 5/7 and 2 Piercing Griefs. Those Piercing Griefs, of course, have Charge, Lifesteal, and Revenge, meaning that they deal 6 damage, gain you 6 life, and then come back into your deck to gain an additional 6 damage and 6 life, and also enable Destiny-related strategies such as Dark Return, Immortalize, for extra cards and allowing you to cycle through your deck a lot faster. After that, every influence that you gain from other abilities, say attacking with your weapon that gains you influence, or playing other cards that gain you influence that don't cost anything, continue to stack Piercing Griefs on top of each other, meaning that depending on where the enablers are, Severin of the Dark is probably a card that can kill your opponent on 6 fairly quickly. If you are using something like a World Shaper's Staff with a simple sacrifice ability, such as, I believe there's one for 3, Combustion Cell would be a pretty reasonable option. Say Combustion Cell and World Shaper's Staff. Play a World Shaper's Staff on a unit, play Severin of the Dark down on 6. Activate your Combustion Cell, get 5 influence, play your Feln banner, and then you have 7 Piercing Griefs with Charge, Lifesteal, and Revenge combined with your Severin of the Dark. That's pretty ridiculous. So Severin of the Dark is a game-changing finisher in specific types of influence building decks, provided there are enough zero-cost enablers for Surge to actually really get Severin to go into places where you want him to go. He's also reasonably statted unit, doesn't have any evasive abilities or relevant like stats or like basically survivability options, so probably going to get killed, but with 7 health, he's pretty hard to kill with most fire-based strategies, and the lifesteal that he provides means that he's a really good card to play against fire aggro decks, provided that you can get to 6 in the first place against said decks. Really powerful Surge effect, clearly has like a lot of value, and so many Piercing Griefs, so many. It's just gonna be all of your faults, just like all your fault all the time. It's all your fault. Yeah, Severin of the Dark is just a ridiculous option for Surge and clearly shows how powerful the mechanic can get at later values, along with the correct enablers, which I assume there will be plenty of. All right, so those are the Surge cards. Next, we want to talk a little bit about the power base. These are not Surge powerful cards, I would say, but they are nonetheless cards that are pretty solid in general. Oh, actually, no, never mind. I'm lying. They are actually kind of ridiculously strong in some ways. So, Combre Vow, it's a green-yellow power that says you may discard a Time or Justice sigil from your deck to gain an influence of that type and take 1 damage. So I might be misreading this. I'm fairly certain that it only says... One second, we'll check this real quick. Okay, I had to double check real quick on the wording on Stonescar Banner and other cards like that. Combre Vow does not give you a Time and Justice influence. It just gives you a Time or a Justice influence if you discard a Time or Justice sigil from your deck to gain an influence and take a damage. This is a really interesting set of trade-offs for a really interesting set of power. First, notably, this is always undepleted power as long as you have sigils in your deck, as opposed to having sigils in your hand. That's something that is pretty relevant, although it also means that if you are playing a low number of sigils, you can potentially disable Combre Vow permanently, unlike, say, Seats or banners, which can be re-enabled if they have some sort of issue where they can't be enabled. So seeking power, that kind of thing, picking up extra power makes Seats undepleted, whereas Combre Vow is always undepleted as long as you have a decent amount of sigils in your deck, which is fairly likely. That being said, you do have to take a damage to get the power access, so that means that you are not going to be able to immediately get the influence that you want. It's also not a double influence card, meaning that it doesn't synergize very well with Surge. That's kind of relevant if you're trying to get like a decent amount of influence together. We can certainly expect to see banners or Seats in the upcoming expedition, but these cards will only like mildly help with that sort of aspect. That being said, they are pretty strong fixers. They function very similar to like diplomatic seals and things like that. I actually don't think that they're terribly powerful power, and it makes sense that they are at an uncommon in terms of their overall value. So I'm curious to see if we'll get any more power of that particular type in this deck, but like the undepleted is definitely a reasonable option, and taking a damage is usually not too big of a deal. So this is something that you can actually do to sort of like give yourself a little bit of extra oomph, provided that you are able to play the card. That being said, like there are a lot of really heavy influence cards in the decks, and Combre Vow doesn't necessarily provide the things that you want for that to happen. So we're going to want to see crests or Seats or banners, or maybe some combination of the 3 in Expedition in addition to these vows. They are really powerful. They are very good in decks that want to sort of dabble between 2 colors or even like change colors very quickly. In those instances, like these are really decent cards, and there's almost no reason not even to run them in like almost monocolored cards with just a little bit of splash. You can actually roll quite a bit of monocolor cards and then still have like banners and Seats and Combre Vows and be able to get your green influence for your time deck very quickly, provided you're willing to take a little bit of damage in the process. It's really a reasonably strong option, but I also think that it kind of doesn't synergize very well with either Surge or the heavy influence cards that we're going to be seeing and talking about, including Diana and Rindra and a couple of the other options. But yeah, that's Combre Vow. Each of them shows off a particular chest. The art on these is not particularly inspired. They have some like interesting things going on with each one, but for the most part, like they are all just boxes. The Felon Vow is a nice little jewelry box, of course. The Huru Vow is a pretty interesting looking like secret box. I actually really like that one quite a bit. The Praxis Vow is a nice little ornate chest with the Praxis insignia on it. And the last one, I believe, is, the Stonescar Vow, which maybe I actually just did that one. But a larger chest with the Stonescar, like pickaxe insignia on it. That pickaxe insignia has not been used very often, but is notable. The Combre Vow, of course, has the Minotaur on it, and the Combre insignia, which is that nice little star. But yeah, it's like overall, they're not super impressive in terms of like art and style. I kind of hope that there's going to be some like old art versions of these, because they're a little bit unimpressive in that respect as well. Still, they're an interesting power option, and they do give you like a really decent amount of other things going on, like basically just undepleted power that is good for your fixing, like should really provide you with a lot of value over time. The decision of whether or not to take these is really interesting, and one of the most notable things about them is that they discard the sigils from your deck, which means that you are removing sigils from your deck and thus removing the possibility that you're going to flood later on. Really, really strong for aggro formats and for mid-range decks that really just don't want to draw power later on. In both situations, Combre Vow is going to be pretty interesting in that respect. They also are strong enablers for cards like Arcanum Hourglass and other things like that. It's pretty interesting the kinds of things that you can do by discarding sigils. There are not that many cards that currently do this, and this is something that happens at power speed, meaning that you are going to be able to take a second look at cards that basically fire off. There's a red one that deals damage for every sigil that's in your void. Arcanum Hourglass and Forgotten Find are both going to be a lot stronger cards. Forgotten Find in particular should be an excellent ramp card that will at least get you 1 ramp for 2 in a Vow deck, and frequently can get you 2 ramp for 2 in a very short period of time. Definitely worth taking another look at that card, since playing 2 power from your void going to be a lot stronger if you're using Vows. So lots of exciting things to do with these cards. They don't push the power level of Throne in any way, which is something that I really appreciate, and like they do enable a bunch of new different strategies with power that should be really, really interesting. All right, so that is all of the cards in the Surge article. Next, we're going to be talking about the community spoilers, which I believe I have all of these. So let's go ahead and get right down to it. Starting off with Rindra Infiltrator. 4 cost, double blue, and quadruple shadow. 2/3 with 4/4 and lifesteal if you've played a spell this turn. This is not a stackable ability. It's basically related to whether or not you played the spell or not. It will be active regardless of whether or not the card is in your hand or void. Basically, like, this card will just always have +4/+4 and lifesteal, similar to other cards that have sort of paid attention to this kind of thing, similar to Shrine to Carvet. Summon, the enemy player discards a card of their choice from their hand. So immediately, just a really good summon effect. This card basically will almost always be at least 1 card's worth of value due to the fact that it removes a card from your opponent's hand and allows you to get a pretty large unit as a result of it. Main problems with it are, if you haven't played a spell on the turn that you play it, which on turn 4 is fairly likely, it's really torchable. Like, if you play this card down on turn 4 and your opponent torches it, they're up a lot in tempo, and losing a card might not have been the biggest deal. That being said, you are pulling removal out of their hand, or pulling the opportunity for removal out of their hand, so playing this in a mid-range value Feln deck is going to be really, really strong, especially since the card provides you with lifesteal, which is really, really important against a wide variety of aggro options. The card is really strong. It's going to be really solid. I think that it is probably a legendary. It has token rarity in this picture, but most likely that was an oversight, and it's probably a legendary or a rare. I think it will be the same rarity as Diana, so we'll talk about Diana in just a moment. But in any case, this is a 6/7 for 4, which is not unreasonable. The main thing about it is that while it's really, really good at countering aggro styles that are running Torch are going to have a field day with it, and Suffocate as well. There's a lot of ways to kill Rindra Infiltrator while it doesn't have lifesteal that are pretty important. The main thing is that if you're playing it later in the game, you will have spells, and your opponent will not want to play something on Rindra if you can play a spell and thus effectively buff it back up to the point where it's not going to die to whatever it is that they're playing. So, for example, if they try to torch it and you play, say, like a Spiteful Strike or just a Devour on one of your other units, or literally any spell, Rindra becomes untorchable and they lose the torch in the process, which is generally a pretty powerful effect. So, something to note, but the card is on again, off again in terms of its stat line, which is a little bit of a reasonable disadvantage, even if it has an amazing stat line and a lot of lifesteal. That being said, powerful card in Throne or Expedition, and would be an insane limited bomb if you drew it. Okay, next up we have Crown Patroller. 2/1 Summon Plunder. This card's real good. It is a 1-cost 2/1. There are not that many of these that are like super good, but 1-cost 2/1 is always a reasonable stat line if you're trying to run aggro. And Crown Patroller comes with Plunder right on top of it, which means that it immediately fixes your power or fixes a hand full of too much power, meaning that you are really capable of transferring Crown Patroller into a mid-range strategy or translating it into a more aggressive strategy that just drew a few too many power in its opening hand. Reasonable stat line, 2/1 is just always like good for aggro. I think this card is going to be a workhorse. It's going to be a really, really powerful limited card. You will want to pick up not necessarily as many of these as you can, but a pretty decent number of these, since they are just a super good 1-cost card for you. to. In Expedition, I expect them to also see a lot of play. I would not be so sure about them in Throne, just because 1-cost cards in Throne are like really not that common, but like certainly they have, I would say that they are of comparable strength to some of the other 2-1s in the format, and the ability to fix with Plunder is really, really good. The main thing about them is that since they are 1-cost 2-1, they are designed to contribute to aggro strategies. Treasure Troves don't necessarily contribute to aggro strategies, especially when you're getting them really, really early, because you don't want to be taking a lot of time to play the Treasure Trove and spend that power. So there is some trade-off here. I think Crown Patroller actually belongs a little bit more in aggro decks that want to go a little bit slower and move up into, say, like 4 or 5 drops. So yeah, that's going to be the question of like how people build around it, whether or not it's actually good in aggro formats in that respect. I still think that it's a great value card that fixes a lot of your deck. It should be a auto include in any deck that you're starting with. If you are unable to basically fill out your deck with your best cards, this is a really good filler card that will basically make your deck work in ways that you wouldn't necessarily expect it to. So yeah, something that I highly recommend for players who are starting out, as well as for limited formats and for expedition formats. I think it's just got a lot of strength to it. That plunder ability is actually really good, and like this is something that, like, as far as plunder goes, is probably going to be one of the premier plunder cards alongside that 2-1 deadly ambush card, which is absolutely ridiculous. Okay, next up we have Ancient Machinist. Alright, when you play a spell with cost 5 or more, transform Ancient Machinist into a Sentinel with strength and health equal to that spell's cost. So basically, as long as you are playing something very, very big, Ancient Machinist is going to become something very, very big. It's a 2-1 for 2 at base stats. Overall, I don't think this card is ridiculously strong. It is nice because if you manage to play like a really, really expensive spell, then you're going to be able to do decent amount of extra damage on top of it, and basically just have like a bunch of big sentinels on top of that spell. So like getting out a Channel the Tempest on 9 after having like 4 Ancient Machinists on the board, you pretty much automatically win the game. That being said, the card is really vulnerable in the meantime, and it's pretty likely to get killed by incidental damage due to that 1 health. Like, it just doesn't seem like it's going to survive Condemn, Vara's Favor, Reverberating Strike. Basically, like, there's a wide variety of things that kill it. Snowballs kill it. I don't see it being popular in Throne. I do think that in Limited it has a little bit of strength. Expedition, I'm skeptical. Certainly the ability to turn it into a giant block of stats is useful, but even then I think the vulnerability of this card kind of makes it unlikely to see a lot of play, especially since the Sentinel itself does not have any skills or abilities that would in any way help it over the course of the game. So it's not too much of a threat, then it's kind of a threat, and then that threat can get dispensed with. It's not necessarily making you go up a card, but it is making you go up a little bit of tempo, tempo that you are in fact losing by playing a 2-1 on turn 2. So overall, this one doesn't really suit me all that well, but I think in Limited it's definitely going to be a decent amount of fun to play, and like it's probably designed for exactly that format. Bubble Shield. This one's 2 green influence for a 1 cost that says give one of your units Aegis as a fast spell. It's Protect. It's Protect when it was broken. That's real strong. Double blue influence is you gain an Aegis, but this hardly matters at all. Like, if you want the Aegis, sure, that's great. If you're in Huru, yes, that's awesome. But even so, you're going to be playing Bubble Shield because it's a fast spell at 1 that protects your units, meaning that if you're playing any amount of green, you're going to be able to protect units that have weapons on them, like, for example, that 1/3 weapon that enables Surge potential, and that is going to allow you to get a lot of extra value. This card is insanely broken powerful. It's really, really good. It might actually be too good, and the double blue influence is going to be part of the determinant in whether or not it's going to be too good, but overall, like, this card like is going to do what Protect did for Throne in previous formats, as well as for Expedition and other things like that. It basically just allows you to play a lot more Voltron-based strategies at a lot safer speeds. This is really something to be paying attention to. I think that it's going to be one of the stronger cards in the set. We will see exactly how good it is, but overall I think that like 1 cost Protect was a very good card that got nerfed for a very good reason, and this does have that double influence to help out a little bit, but this might be something that like is going to really like make an impact in terms of what kind of decks you can build in Throne and Expedition. In limited formats, Aegis is not as important, but it's still a reasonable effect. You can certainly do that to build a Voltron-type setup. One of the examples of cards that are actually a little bit stronger in constructed formats than in limited formats. All right, Grave Robbery. Voidbound. Sacrifice a unit to draw a card of your choice from the enemy void. Really nice if you have a bunch of like little random tokens, like cultists or turn to seeds, that kind of thing. Basically allows you to steal something of your opponent's, particularly something with Destiny like Piercing Grief, or any of the cards that are being given Destiny by the new blue card. I think it's called Beseech. No, it's not Beseech the Throne. It's the Shared Visions, I think it is. In any case, like this is something that basically allows you to counter out some Destiny-based strategies. If they become very popular, it's a solid market card on that option. It's also just kind of reasonable if you're playing tokens in Limited or playing tokens in Expedition. That cost, I think, is the biggest problem. It is void-bound and also has a really significant cost, and that significant cost means that it's not going to be as good as a Dark Return or Immortalize. Stealing one of your opponent's card is almost a little bit nicer since you managed to counter out their stuff while also getting a unit of your choice from their pile, but like, which sometimes decks counter themselves. Even so, the cost of this card is pretty prohibitive. 3 and a sacrifice is a lot to steal a unit from your opponent's void, and that means that you also have to be reliant on your opponent having a particular setup, so it's probably not going to see play as more than a market card. You can definitely use it in tokens and Limited, but not too many other places. It's just a little too expensive for that. Volatile Grenadin. Summon 2/2. The enemy player must choose give Volatile Grenadin +3/+3, or it deals 4 damage to them. Super high influence cost, but there may be 1-cost influence fixers. It has 3 red influence to start. So we have seen an evolution in choice cards, starting from Won't Be Pretty, which was absolute garbage, to Breath of Voprex, which was mostly garbage, to Volatile Grenadin, which I actually think is okay. This is a 2-cost 2/2 that basically is either a 5/5 or is dealing a decent amount of damage to your opponent. Give this card, for example, double damage off of Touch of Force, and look at what kind of choices it offers. It's really ridiculous in those particular aspects. Because it is an enemy choice card, it's never going to do the thing that you most want it to do, but the thing that you least want it to do is still pretty good. Like 2-cost deal 4 and get a 2/2 is pretty reasonable. 2-cost get a 5/5 is absolutely absurd. So unless your opponent is going to be like spending an Annihilate or a Defile on a base 2/2, this is still like really reasonable things to be doing in an aggro list. I think that overall that's kind of interesting. The one thing about it is that it is a 2/2 that you can't necessarily play on turn 2, which does disable some aggro strategies that might really want to play with it. I think that this card is actually pretty strong, though. Giving it charge or double damage off of certain setups like Death Pit would really make that choice a lot harder, and like if you can play around with Dark Returns and other things like that, Volatile Grenadin's recursive ability becomes really interesting. It's just a very interesting card in a wide variety of ways. It's obviously awkward to play, but I think that it's reasonable to play in most circumstances and gives you a decent amount of benefits in Limited or Expedition. Throne-wise, might be a little bit hard to do, but it's a really relevant unit type at the very least. Grenadins are nice, and there aren't enough good 2-drop Grenadins, so that is certainly something to be playing around with and getting a little bit of benefits out of. Alright, next up, these cards are never the same size. Natural Order 3-cost killer with Revenge. So 3-cost, give a unit killer with Revenge. So yeah, slow spell, really expensive, has Revenge, but overall, like, that speed is pretty bad. You need to have a big unit out on the field that is actually really comfortable with having killer. The obvious example would probably be the new Rindra, which is going to be a 6/7 on your turn because you are playing Natural Order. So this pairs really well with that card, but also, like, at common and at this cost, this card is almost unplayable. It's not a Predator's Instinct or a Twilight Hunt. It's definitely not a Xenon Initiation. The repeatability of it is a little bit difficult, and I think that that has been like sort of the design of the common revenge cards that we've seen so far. Like we also saw this with Silence, where you just might not have a target when the card revenges again. Even so, like, Natural Order does pair okay with some cards. I would see it as very unlikely to make Expedition or Throne decks, but it is possible since it gives you some card advantage and gives you a way to kill units that you may not have in blue decks. I could see it as like a Huru removal card, for example. There's typically very little removal in those formats, but at the same time, you got to have a big unit. So whether or not you're going to have that is going to be sort of determinant on whether or not Natural Order is any good at all. And I think that the cost of it is skeptical. Sewer Crocodile. Love the design of this card. 3 cost 0/6 with Decay. When you play a card on the enemy turn, Sewer Crocodile gets +1/+1, or +1 strength. So it is just a solid wall that even if you don't necessarily have like a spell in your hand, your opponent is pretty reticent, I would say, to attack into. It can attack reasonably after you have played a number of other cards, but you have to play them on the enemy turn. So notably, this plays with ambush and spell cards, any fast spell, any trick of any kind. If you're playing with the time card, that's the 2/1, that's going to be like a really solid option here. Basically, the nice thing about it is that as a 1/6, it's going to permanently decrease your opponent's board state and disable 2/2s, 2/3s, 3/3s, 4/4s. Basically, any number of units that are attacking into a Sewer Crocodile, you can then play a card to either buff up the Sewer Crocodile, +1 strength, or you can play a card to kill an opposing unit and then use Sewer Crocodile to reduce one of their units by 1, which is pretty big deal. Like that decay ability, -1/-1 for each strength that Sewer Crocodile has, is going to be a big thing in terms of making Sewer Crocodile like a very strong limited card. I don't know if it's got a lot of expedition potential just because it's slow, but it is such a scary wall, and it's a really good way to sort of like move into your later turns. I think this is a limited bomb in some ways and can be like really, really good in getting into the later cards. If you pick up, for example, that Severin as a rare, this is the card that helps you get there, and yeah, that's going to be something that like, it's just a really fun card to play around. It has a really satisfying pattern that stagnates the game a little bit, which might be something to be worried about, but overall is going to like make it so that you can do some really fancy tricks and make your opponent very, very nervous every time they're attacking into you, which I wholeheartedly support. Storm Prowler. +1/+1 for each of your units, and flying at a 6 cost. It's not terrible, but it's definitely only a limited bomb. It's a big dinosaur, and it can be as big as a 12/12. 12/12 is honestly not that big. If you already got 12 units on the board, a 12/12 flyer is kind of going to make the difference, but I wouldn't say it's going to be like super important one way or the other. It pairs really well with that Revenge card that generates 1/2s. Seems like a limited bomb, but Throne or Expedition probably going to give this a pass, especially considering the card's extremely high influence cost. More likely this is something like a 4/4 or 5/5, and notably your opponent can control how much strength and health it has in order to basically like tone it down by killing some of your other units before throwing an Obliterate at it or whatever they want to do. If they need to kill it, they might be able to like creatively block or do something to reduce the card down to the point where it is manageable, and that degree of control that they have makes the card a lot worse in my opinion. Trickshot Ruffian. 1/2, summon you may give another unit strength and health equal to your green influence, and lifesteal this turn. Very strong for a 1-drop. This is obviously not going to be amazing as like a aggressive card, since you really don't even want to play it on 1, but the extra strength and extra health combined with lifesteal means that it is something that counters aggro out really well, and basically gives you a 1-drop that you can use to sort of pull into your later game with a lot of value. You get a lot of extra health, you get a kind of defensive unit that at least trades with smaller things and doesn't die to stuff like Vara's Favor, and you get a big burst of green influence lifesteal that can be very, very powerful on a double damage unit or a flying unit. Seems really, really good, but like overall it's not like an aggressive card, it's more of a like mid-range card, which something to pay attention to, but nonetheless it's like a very powerful effect that should be pretty interesting for a 1-drop. I think that it's got some places that it can be played. All right, Diana Face Shield. This one is a little bit different looking, but yeah, 4 cost, time, justice, and like Rindra should probably be legendary. Yeah, so we've got a legendary here. Flying, summon, draw a card, you gain 2 health and 2 armor, so right away replaces itself with a new card and gives you some benefit on the board. Stat line 2/4, not that great, but since the card is replacing itself, can't really argue with it, especially since it has flying. You pay 12 to give Diana strength and health equal to your total influence, which is going to be at least 6, meaning that this card at 12 is going to be absolutely bonkers. It's another great Combre power boosting card. I think that that's definitely got some strength and should be really interesting to see, but like whether or not that's going to be a big deal or not depends on I wouldn't say it depends on a number of factors, but I would say that like you really need to get a lot of influence together and a lot of power together in a very short order, which might be somewhat tricky. Nonetheless, seems like a cool Ironthorn card where you're playing just a ton of Combre influence. If you want to play stuff like Minotaur Ambassador, your standard sort of Martyr's Chains deck really wants to play around with this type of card and should be able to have a pretty good time with it, since the card is replacing itself and also giving you a defensive flyer that can be used in a wide variety of interesting ways. Card has survivability and transitions well into the late game, where it then kills your opponent with unstoppable reach. So as a value engine, just solid through and through. Zaxo Leviathan, Decay and Overwhelm. Satisfying. Decay on a big giant unit is always fun, in my opinion. Like, yeah, it's pretty interesting to see, even though it almost never makes a difference. It just means that you obliterate whatever you attack into. Entomb, play the top card of your deck. If it costs 3 or more, repeat the Entomb. Ooh, boy. So, yeah, we have a deck that plays with this, obviously. This is Birthright and oh, man, I forgot it already. It's a 9/7 that plays cards off the top of your deck. Yeah, Birthright, that kind of stuff, combined with Zaxo Leviathan. You just play a bunch of, like, ridiculous 6-drops. You have no early game whatsoever, but then, like, once you get a Zaxo Leviathan out, you devour it or eat it with something, and you get to play even more of the top cards of your deck, and do it all over again. Could be really, really fun. There's also some like weird stuff that you could potentially do where like you play units that kill units and things like that. I think that this is a really interesting and scary big drop. It's a solid 9-drop to unstable form into or anything along those lines. So there aren't very many cards of this particular cost, and this is a really, really solid one for that cost. Love everything it does. It has good reach, which is important for providing inevitability, and the ability to just basically make all of your big stuff play at once is intensely satisfying. I love the design of this card. It's greedy, it's fun, it's super Praxis, and I'm very, very into it. All right, 2 left. Bartholo's Keepsake. Draw a unit, weapon, or power of your choice from the top 4 cards of your deck and bottom the rest. Double green influence. If this costs 3 or less, play it instead. So, yeah, reasonable option. Bartholo's Keepsake notably plays Bartholo if you manage to pick it out. It's a kind of a bad scheme in some aspects, especially since it can't even pick up cards if you get, say, 4 spells, which is unlikely, but with a search like this, you definitely don't want to have unreliability attached to it. You clearly need to be an Argenborg colors to really get the benefit that you're looking for, and at that point the only thing you're getting is selection, which maybe that's good, but it's a little bit hard to deal with, and if you don't get the thing that you want, then you might have a little bit of difficulty with it. It's kind of an interesting option for Argenport aggro. I think there's definitely some power potential for it in a constructed type deck, but I'm also skeptical that the card really provides a lot of value. So yeah, it's interesting, but I wouldn't say that it's like insanely powerful. Ancient Serpent. Flying, summon, draw a spell from your void, it gains Voidbound. Well, that's a reasonable effect if you're playing on a flying unit. Very good limited card. Seems unlikely to play over Prodigious Sorcery in Expedition or Throne, but nonetheless, like, being able to get spells back is really handy, and if you're playing with, like, say, Static Bolts or something like that, or if Static Bolts are, in fact, a draft card, that would be delicious. Yeah, this is kind of a fun card in that respect. I think there's a lot of things you can do with these types of effects, and drawing spells from your void is always a powerful thing to have, particularly in a limited format. That being said, the card is very expensive, so Throne or Expedition, probably not going to see as much play with it. Still a cool card, decent design. Yep, I do have 2 more that I had at the bottom here. Next up, we have... Okay, you wanna show up, actually, card? Try that one more time. Wandering Beholder. 1 cost, Decay, +2/+2 and Overwhelm if you have 5 influence of every type, and with multiple influence of every type, 3 of each in fact, has Aegis, double damage, and lifesteal. So clearly a World Shaper staff beneficiary. If you're playing with colorless cards that want to generate all 5 different colors, this is something that can really sort of play out and do some interesting value. That being said, a 3/3 with double damage and lifesteal and Aegis and Overwhelm and Decay, all 5 of those stats do not actually make that good of a unit. It's only like a 6/3 effectively. It has Decay, which is nice, but it still doesn't trade very well because it only has 3 health. The Aegis is fairly helpful, but the card is most likely only going to get you like a reasonable amount of damage combined with a little bit of lifesteal. I don't know that the onboard impact is worth all of the hoops that you have to jump through. It is very efficient at that point, but it's still like effectively not that huge of an impact on the game. Once you give it like deadly or quick draw, if you can give it even more skills, but like at the point where you're asking like what more skills can you give to it, you have to really be thinking about what kind of deck you're looking at this point, because you're trying to get all of this influence together, which is going to make it very difficult to generate any other tempo, and your reward is a card that is very, very good on tempo. It's a cultist, at least. You can definitely do some interesting things with it, and a 1/1 decay is certainly not the worst thing in the world, so reasonable effect that you can definitely put into any limited deck, and of course something that you can play in an expedition deck if you are trying to generate the perfect Wandering Beholder, combined with a number of other 5-cost cards. But it's not going to be like your primary slot in, it's just going to be something I think that sort of helps the deck that is 5 colors get to where it's going, as opposed to something that just wins the game on its own, which as a 1-drop, I suppose you can't really ask for more than that. Nonetheless, I'm not terribly impressed with it. Murky Tentaclesis. Pretty sure that's how you pronounce it. Not 100% certain, but Murky Tentaclesis, one of my favorite designs in the spoilers. So this is a 5/2 for 5. I actually read that as a 2/2 for 5, but that's still great. Unblockable. When you play a card with Destiny, draw Murky Tentaclesis from your void. Really kind of delightful. So this, to me, is similar to like a... It reminds me of like a platforming boss where, you know, you have those bosses that are like the individual like health value of the boss is something that you have to attack, but that bosses always summon like tentacles that also have to take damage and be killed and are more of a threat. So you have to sort of figure out whether or not you're addressing the tentacle or you're addressing the boss. This makes any cute animal into a tentacle monster that you have to kill in the same way that you might kill like a boss in the Carnival of Horrors of Arkham Horror. It's just a ridiculous option to like sort of make any unit into a horrible tentacle beast, and I love it. Yeah, unblockable 5/2 is a reasonable stat line. This card is obviously easy to kill, but it also provides you with a ton of reach in Shadow, which is something that Shadow can struggle with, and the ability to basically use Destiny to generate more tentacles is really, really cool. The one thing that you really want is for this card to have Destiny itself, which is probably something that you can do if you are playing in a Feln deck that's using the blue card that grants Destiny, or playing with a wide variety of revenge units, which is much more likely. Mokto with tentacles is definitely going to be a thing. Basically, like any revenge card will have tentacles. I think there's a lot of like fun art to be made. There's a lot of stupid stuff that you can do with this. In any case, making all of your units into tentacle monsters is delightful. I like that it basically like is tentacles. It's not like a beast itself. It's just like a bunch of extra things that you can attach to your revenge units. That's hilarious and beautiful and a little bit disturbing. And that's our spoiler review. Didn't intend to end on this card, but that's where we ended. Thank you all so much for watching. I realized this was a long one, so we'll try, but we didn't expect a mechanics review. I was literally sitting down to do the community spoiler breakdown for batch 1, and there was another mechanic, so we had a lot more cards to talk about as a result. But yeah, we'll be back with the next community spoiler breakdown as it comes out. Those cards were being, I believe, applied for today, so they should be sent out over the next couple of days. And we'll probably have one up by Wednesday, would be my guess. You can subscribe and hit the bell to, be notified when that happens. As always, thank you so much for watching. I am Locopojo on YouTube, Patreon, and Twitter. So see you guys later. Have a wonderful evening or morning or whatever particular time of day it is. And yeah, have a good one, folks. Thanks for watching.